So these discussions have kind of led up to the Louisiana Redistricting Summit, which is a bipartisan summit focused on what Louisiana can do about its redistricting process. It's going to happen in January at the LSU Riley Center for Media and Public Affairs. It's a day-long summit. It's going to have keynote speakers, and it's going to have panel discussions, and it's going to focus on things like how Louisiana draws its districts, potential changes to this process, and very importantly, potential state responses to the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision that's going to come down next June. And our plan is to collect today's discussions into a report that we're going to send to the governor's office and to all the legislatures. And we do plan on having one of these reform options to be implemented in the spring legislative session. So to give you a little more background on the summit, committed participants so far include Michael Lee and Tom Wolf. They're experts on redistricting from the Brennan Center for Justice in New York. We have Brian Marks and Jonathan Winburn. Brian Marks is a geographer from LSU, and Jonathan Winburn is a UM Poli-Sci professor. They're also experts on redistricting, and they're kind of more focused on this region, which is why we want their expertise. And in terms of folks from the legislature, we have Ted James, Dan Claytor, Pat Smith, all local legislators. We have Walt Leger down from New Orleans, Norby Chabert from Cajun Country, and Tanner McGee. And also we have a local judge, Don Johnson. He's a district court judge here at Baton Rouge. He's going to be joining for some of the panel discussions. And in terms of other groups that are joining us, the Council for Better Louisiana is going to be moderating one of the panel discussions, and the League of Women Voters is going to be coming. So that's kind of the overview of the summit. And if you look to the press release, we have, for instance, a great quote from Norby Chabert saying that partisan gerrymandering has contributed to the depolarization that we see in our politics today, and the summit represents a conversation that is long overdue. And if you caught the AP article that came out last week, Julie Stokes, who is a Republican from Metairie, she was saying that the moderate voices aren't being heard because our districts are either ultra liberal or ultra conservative, and so everybody is being drowned out unless you're a radical. And we're hoping redistricting reform will really help us solve that. Let me see if I have anything else. Oh, and the third part of your release is just a very simple flow chart showing how things might go depending on certain actions. We're having our summit in January 2018, and then we're going to have the legislative session right after that. We would love for a reform to be passed then. But whether or not that happens, there's going to be the Gilby-Whitford opinion handed down in June of 2018. I think it's more likely than not that it's going to be a landmark sweeping decision, and it's going to force a state response. Whether or not that happens is another opportunity for change. 2019 is a fiscal session, but the 2020 legislative session allows us to re-attempt state level reform again, and also align our existing reform with Gilby-Whitford. And then of course we have the 2020 U.S. Census, and then our districts will be redrawn in 2021 legislative session. So that's where things stand, and we hope you guys just keep attention on this issue, and of course join us for the summit in January. And with that, Brian Marks is going to give his piece of it.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Stephen. I was asked to speak regarding the academic side of the conversation. I am, as he's mentioned, one of the featured speakers for the upcoming summit on fair districting in Louisiana. I'm an assistant professor of geography in the Department of Geography and Anthropology at Louisiana State University here in Baton Rouge. Incidentally, it's B-R-I-A-N-M-A-R-K-S, if you're a reporter and you want to get that right. I teach a course at LSU called Political Geography. That course is not exclusively about redistricting, but redistricting, the census, apportionment, and the legal and geographical iterations of all those questions are very central to the course. So this is a subject I'm teaching, frankly, right now, and it's very interesting that there is now a movement in the state of Louisiana, as there is in many other parts of the country, to try to make redistricting fairer. Because we are living in a time, since 2011, 2012, the last redistricting cycle, in America we have reapportionment, switching around which states have how many of the 435 US House seats after every decadal census. And afterwards we do redistricting, moving around inside of the states all of the congressional and House and state Senate and school board and everything else districts. And of course this has become a tremendously partisan and contentious issue. Although it is not issues like abortion, guns, other issues that raise themselves very high, redistricting is a rather wonkish and technical subject, but it is the rules through which you get, in part, the majority, or fail to get the majority, to move on issues like abortion and guns and everything else that are the so-called hot button issues. So it's extremely important, and it has been taken to an extreme extent. What do I mean by that? I mean partisan gerrymandering. And I should say what I mean by gerrymandering, and what do we mean by partisan, because there are other kinds. So Eldridge Gerry, one of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, gave us the term gerrymandering. It's a practice as old as the American Republic, and probably older then, of drawing district lines in a often rather fanciful way in order to bring about a condition where you win an election without winning the majority of the votes in a larger sense. And that can be done in all sorts of ways. It has been with us for our whole republic, but it is something which has drastically accelerated since the 2010 redistricting cycle. That was intentional. That was an intentional objective, which wasn't a secret, by one of the major political parties in this country. I'll let you figure out which one, to take over state houses, state senates, and governorships, which they were succeeded in the 2010 wave election, helped them along, in time for the 2012 redrawing of the maps, in order to flip as many US House seats as possible through redrawing the maps in a manner that would benefit them. So in 2012, the Republican Party got a 33 House seat majority, even though nationwide, in terms of the US House popular vote, they earned a numerical minority of votes. That is one aspect, which of course could go the other way as well in different circumstances, of partisan gerrymandering. There are other forms of gerrymandering which we know about here down in the Deep South, particularly racial gerrymandering as part of the shameful history of generally disenfranchising racial minorities in the South. In the absence of the ability to directly disenfranchise black voters after the 1965 Voting Rights Act, not surprisingly, gerrymandering in order to suppress and dilute black voters became a favorite tactic by some individuals. So we do have, in this part of the country, also a long history of both what we might call affirmative action gerrymandering to create majority-minority districts in which racial minorities can elect a candidate of their choice, as well as what we might call the bad kind of racial gerrymandering, which is illegal under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We are primarily talking about here, in a nationwide context, partisan gerrymandering. And given the fact that Louisiana has highly racially polarized partisanship, mostly African Americans vote Democratic, mostly white voters vote Republican in this state, certainly in the past decade, it's very hard to tell which is which. Racial gerrymandering is by and large illegal in this country. Partisan gerrymandering has been treated by the US Supreme Court as a quote-unquote political and non-judiciable question, which means it's up to the legislatures of the various states, and the courts can't get involved. So if you say, I'm not trying to put all the black voters in a district so that they can't get too many people elected, I'm just trying to do this to the Democrats, even though they're the same people, that's legal. Or vice versa in the other group. So partisan gerrymandering is legal. It is a political question, but it may not be so for many more years. Because in the Supreme Court, the argument was held on, I believe, the 3rd of October of this year, the Gill v. Whitford case from Wisconsin, is a case in which they are up there trying the question of, is there in fact a constitutional limit to how far you can gerrymander on the basis of political partisanship? And there are numerous, we won't get into the details this afternoon unless you ask a question about it, there are numerous social science quantitative measures for how do you measure how partisan gerrymandered is a district. But fundamentally they come down to this question. If I have 50% of the vote statewide, say among the 6 different congressional districts in Louisiana, if I get 50% of the vote, do I win 50% of the seats? If I get 60% of the vote, do I get 60% of the seats? And vice versa, if the other side gets 50 or 60 or 70%, do they get a proportional number of seats to their number of votes? And if we find, for example, that well, if one party gets 60 or 70%, they get 30 or 40% of the seats. But if the other party gets 60 or 70%, they get 70, 80, 90% of the seats. That would be a partisan gap between the two. Likewise, there are other measures that measure how many so-called wasted votes. All you need to win an election is 50% plus 1. If you are, as we use the gerrymandering term, packing a large number of Democrats and Republicans into one district so that they win 70, 80, 90% of the popular vote, and everybody plus over the 50% line is a wasted vote. If you redistribute those voters across more districts, you would have more competitive elections, and you would potentially have more, let's call them purple or pink or baby blue, as opposed to dark blue or dark red districts. So that's what we're talking about. Interestingly, and not surprisingly, down here in the Deep South, where so many of the other problems of American electoral democracy were birthed and perfected through our long and often ugly history, partisan gerrymandering is the worst down here in the Deep South, according to, it's McGann et al. It's one of the outlets I've given you here. It's from their 2016 book, Gerrymandering in America. They were one of the many amicus curiae briefers to the US Supreme Court. And it's towards the back of it, there's the top 10 most partisan biased districts, states. And Alabama's number 1, Mississippi's number 2, Louisiana's number 6 out of 10. We are a highly gerrymandered state. Not surprisingly, the 2 states outside of the South are Ohio and Pennsylvania, which of course happen to be swing states. Maybe people didn't think Pennsylvania, but then they saw the blue wall collapse last November. Pennsylvania is a red state with 2 cities on either end of it, called Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. There is a strong social science correlation that we notice all over the country. Gerrymandering is the worst where the districts are the most contentious. North Carolina, Virginia, Ohio, now Wisconsin, which is now a swing state, as well as the historically Deep South segregationist states that used to be covered under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So this is an issue that really affects Louisiana. We're not an outlier in the good sense. We're like off so many things in Louisiana, we're an outlier on the bad side. And I think it strikes against a fundamental principle of American democracy, that your vote should count the same as everybody else's. If I vote for a particular party or a particular candidate, and my vote counts for half as much as someone else because one political party has maneuvered the district lines so that their vote counts for more bang for their electoral buck, then it's no different fundamentally to me than a 3/5 compromise in the Constitution of saying some people don't count for as much for apportionment or a poll tax or anything else. It's diluting one part of the country's vote and getting some people more voting strength than what their numbers count for. What exactly can be done? Well, a lot of things can be done, and I'll wrap up with this. We will be discussing that next year at the districting summit. Different states, not all dark blue states, not all Democratic states, have moved towards taking the politics out of redistricting. There are very objective, very nonpartisan standards for making districts that are competitive, that respond to if the voters swing to the right or swing to the left, that their elections have consequences that are proportionate to how the voters move. And those don't just have to include independent commissions. basically taking the redistricting process out of the hands of the legislature. But it can mean also putting in place for the legislature guidelines to restrict what they can do. And I think this is in fact a matter of limited government. I think in fact it's a conservative principle to say that government needs to respect the limitations upon its actions to not abuse the equal power of every American citizen's vote. I don't think this is making government bigger. I don't think this is a partisan issue that ought to be made a partisan issue, but it is a partisan issue in that some are winning and some are not. There are, of course, Democratic gerrymandered states. Maryland is the most egregious example. It's a heavily gerrymandered Democratic state, and down here before we became a Republican state, there was very aggressive gerrymandering in states like Georgia and Texas and so forth by the Democratic Party. So all political parties could participate in this. And given the flow of money into redistricting, the extreme partisan consequences of potentially controlling the House, and which is of course extremely important for moving all sorts of things at a nationwide level, we have an arms race. Because frankly, the Republican Party got the slip in 2010, and the Democratic Party is catching up. So we are heading towards a huge fight in 2020 if the Supreme Court allows partisan gerrymandering to go on. And I think all of the states that can't, through local federated action at your state levels, need to try to cool this off. And I think a state like Louisiana could really show the rest of the country what could be possible. Some states like Arizona. Arizona is a pinkish state. Let's not call it a red state. But it's a pink state. And Arizona has implemented a commission process. So it can be done in a state which is divided. It can be done in a state that leans Republican. And I think it can be done here in Louisiana. And I think we will have a fairer electoral system that will bring more public confidence in our electoral system. One of the things that people say universally, I think gerrymandering and redistricting is about as popular as the flu or cholera in the United States. It's not an issue where one side says it's great and the other side says it's bad, like almost everything else at this point. It hasn't become a culture war fight yet. So I think it is an opportunity for fair-minded individuals to think about this and put their heads together and figure something out. I suspect my time is well over by now. Is that correct? Okay.
I have a question about the U.S. House of Representative seats.
Z, let me interrupt you. Pardon me. Were y'all through yet or no?
I think we were done with the speaking, and now we're going to take questions. It's kind of round table together. Yeah.
I had.
One thing, we just ask that you also repeat the question. You can sit for the microphone.
Sure. Yeah.
When I ran for U.S. Representative, U.S. House, I had to go around the state to get to cover all the gerrymandered districts. So, is it possible to do a purple gerrymandering of our districts so that it would be easier to cover?
I think you're asking if it's possible to create more compact districts in which they're not kind of riding around the state like a stick.
So the question for the television audience,
Yeah.
the question was, the gentleman who asked the question was asking, when he ran for the U.S. House, he had to travel to all the different gerrymandered bits and pieces of a rather creatively drawn district. Is this the second or the sixth or which district?
Sixth.
The sixth district, okay. So is it possible to draw a district, let's say, is a more normal shape?
Right. And that's the issue of compactness, whereas the borders of a district are as close as possible to the center of the district. And so that would more make it possible for a district to represent the community as opposed to cutting communities in half and go riding across the state, basically.
And I'll just follow up very briefly. Compactness is the sense of a district looks like a normal thing that you would draw,
Yeah.
not some crazy Jackson Pollock painting looking strange thing. A really uncompact district is often circumstantial evidence that something else really strange is going on. But there is a possibility of fair, from a partisan perspective, districts that are also not very compact. But oftentimes we see very non-compact districts that are also extremely abnormal around these other criteria that I think are a little more important. But when you show people, this is gerrymandering, look at how bad this is. Usually it's a map of one of these districts.
It just doesn't make sense, yeah.
From both the congressional level and then also on the state house level, are there some prime examples here in Louisiana that you'd like to point to as being the worst of the worst?
So the question was, what are some prime examples of badly gerrymandered districts in Louisiana at the congressional and state level? What first comes to mind at the congressional level is Sedgwick Richmond's district. What comes to you for the state legislative district?
Just to deal with the U.S. House, which is a little more in everybody's mind. The way that the 1st district, the 6th district, and the 2nd district are all convoluted together. And if you follow, I mean, I live just north of LSU. So across the street from me, which is the middle of Baton Rouge, across the street from me is Sedgwick Richmond, and I'm in Garrett Graves district.
Yeah.
Half of Baton Rouge is Garrett Graves, and half of it's Sedgwick Richmond, and half of the New Orleans metro area. And you have Steve Scalise's district, the 1st district, which goes from the North Shore, and you have to sort of swim across the Wrigley's and Chef Pass to get down to Plaquemines and so forth. Those are both drawn for, I think, what is a fair and legitimate and legally necessary purpose of maintaining a majority-minority district in the 2nd district for that purpose. Also, it's drawn for incumbency protection for all 3 politicians, and it's drawn in a way that it wastes both Republican votes in Steve Scalise's district. It's packed with Republicans, and the 2nd district is packed with Democrats. I would say more than is necessary to get even incumbency protection. So we don't really have competitive elections anywhere. If you think about the votes, we're about 40% Democrat, about 60% Republican, and we have 16 2/3% representation in the Democratic Party. And we have no purple districts. So overall, I think that's the problem.
And the end result is that the elections happen in the primaries and not actually on election day. So.
If I may follow up to that, sorry, then what if you have to maintain protections for the minorities at the same time, how do you balance that then with what do you see as the main goal for these districts? What does the ideal district look like?
So he's asking how do you balance the desire for competitive districts with the requirements of the Voting Rights Act? Do you have more to say about that?
Sure. There are many states that have large numbers, in fact, of majority-minority districts. Illinois does it, New York City and the rest of New York does it, California does it, Florida does it reasonably well. There's some exceptions to that. And they still have partisan fairness overall. And they tend to look a lot better on these objective standards of partisan bias and partisan gerrymandering. So part of that is, of course, it's somewhat of a zero-sum game. You can't have, in a state like Louisiana, which is about 30% African American, you can't have too many majority black districts and have everyone else also be partisan competitive. So you can't maximize everything, but there are many other states where you can do this, and it is done. So I think we could not get necessarily as fair and as partisan balanced as some other places because of the geography of where people live in Louisiana and because of the partisan divide by race in Louisiana. It's not the same in California. But other states are showing that you can take some of the partisan bias out.
Okay. For those who aren't familiar with the issues involved in Gill versus Whitford, can you give us a Reader's Digest condensed version of what the argument is about?
The question was for a synopsis of the Gill v. Woodford Supreme Court case, which will be decided in June. And it stems from Wisconsin, and that there was intentional partisan gerrymandering that was so extreme that it violates people's First Amendment rights. Anything more to say on that?
The party in power in Wisconsin, given how contentious Wisconsin state politics have become, drew districts that the plaintiffs in the case argued were extreme partisan gerrymandering, which put into place, I don't recall the exact numbers, but they put in place on the basis of a minority of popular votes in the state for that ruling party, a significant majority in the state house. And
I think 48% of the vote yielded maybe a 10+ margin in the House or something like that.
Yeah.
I'll get to the mic, please.
Oh.
sorry.
I believe 48% of the vote in Wisconsin yielded a 10+ seat margin for the Wisconsin legislature.
I guess could you just speak a little to Louisiana's specific process for redistricting? I know it goes through the state legislature, and then kind of describe some of these more, what you consider to be a more ideal process of redistricting.
The question was, how does Louisiana currently do this process, and what are some ways it could do it in the future? Honestly, in 2011, I feel like a lot of legislatures got in the back room together and drew them out and then handed them down. Is that accurate to describe?
Well, let me say that it's a long story,
Yeah.
and those who were really intimately involved in it can probably say it far better. There was, on at least the surface level, because we went from 7 to 6 congressional districts, we lost a seat due to reapportionment nationwide. This becomes a musical chairs game where one congressman doesn't have a seat at the end. So it becomes a very nasty argument. In the case of Louisiana, it was intra-Republican Party about who wouldn't have a job. And ultimately, it was South Louisiana that lost out. North Louisiana was more or less kept intact. And the second district was maintained as a majority-minority district with a rather high, almost 2/3 Democrat voters in place. So the details of that are sort of how the sausage got ground out. And ultimately, it passed the legislature. The way that Louisiana does redistricting is the way most states still do it. The legislature draws a map, it's voted on by both houses, it's approved by the governor, and that's the standard way the majority of states do it. Other states have a partisan or bipartisan or nonpartisan commission. Many states get mired in the courts, and ultimately a federal judge draws the districts. But in 2011, 2012, it was passed by the governor, signed by the governor, and passed by both houses.
Now, doesn't it in Louisiana, though, have to be approved as well by the federal judiciary? The Department of Justice?
I'm still waiting. For
Pre-clearance? I'm sorry?
I was just waiting for the second part of my question
Oh, okay.
about what is the more ideal
Okay.
way to draw.
Okay. So we talked about independent commissions. They can be either bipartisan or nonpartisan, and they draw districts, and then they are approved by the legislature and the governor. Do you know more about like some specific guardrails that could be in place, or if the legislature is involved? If you want to talk about that, sure. Yeah.
One of the principles that is upheld in federal law, it's not really up to us, would be things like population equality and maintenance of the Voting Rights Act. But beyond that, there's a bunch of, you might call them best practices that could be written into either how a commission would work or rules that would need to govern legislative redistricting, such as increasing the competitiveness, basically meaning making electoral districts more purple, less blue or less red, or responsiveness, making it more likely that a district would flip if the voters were to move to the left or move to the right, as well as maintaining parish and other boundaries, electoral boundaries within the state, and respecting what are called communities of interest, which is to say, keeping all the Acadiana people around Lafayette within a district, keeping the North Shore intact, keeping a district around Baton Rouge and around New Orleans. These are often called traditional redistricting principles. And often in these kind of extreme gerrymanders, all of those kinds of rules are systematically broken. And you get these very strange, modern art looking kinds of districts.
And on the note of communities of interest, obviously most Americans do not identify as either a Republican or a Democrat, and it seems like we're drawing our districts totally based on one of the two parties. So you need to ask your questions that make a lot of sense, given that most Americans don't belong to these parties, pretty much don't like them. So.
I have a question here. You're saying to redraw based upon competitiveness, so you're still dealing with the partisanship issue. Nowhere have you said how culture or how poverty or how just simple pre-existing political lines should play into the factor. All you said is create an independent force that again deals with partisanship based upon either making it more competitive or not based upon maybe cultural items that might align districts more fairly. So I think she was trying to ask, how do you make this better? Other than making this independent, how do you make this better?
So I think the question was, how do we take into account cultural aspects of communities as opposed to just partisanship? Is that what you're asking?
Because right now, we're hearing that your argument is that it's primarily based on partisanship and or race.
Right.
So what other aspects, cultural aspects, should be prioritized over those factors?
Well, what first needs to be said is that Fair Districts Louisiana is not supporting any particular reform option right now. We want to be the conduit by which this conversation is had, starting with the summit in January. That said, I think the idea of communities of interest, like keeping Cajun Country together, the North Shore together, New Orleans together, that would fulfill the requirement of having a culturally cohesive district.
To repeat the question, we should do that. The question was, we are mentioning about increasing competitiveness and addressing partisanship and also race questions. What about culture and what about region and so forth? It's much fuzzier in state and federal redistricting what exactly those kind of cultural lines are. But people recognize things like the Mississippi River or a mountain range or these sorts of things. You could make lots of silly cultural arguments that people that eat boudin and people that are Baptists from North Louisiana and cook white gravy instead, that they shouldn't be in a district together and so forth. That's a very fuzzy thing to try to draw districts around. I know from experience about these things. Certainly in the 2012 redistricting, there was a lot of argument about keeping the coastal parishes together, and they were fairly badly chopped up in terms of the congressional delegation. And also, the integrity of Baton Rouge as a congressional district was broken up from what it used to be. So those are issues that I think are well governed in terms of a community of interest, although it is a very subjective definition, whether it's a districting commission or a judge that does it or the legislature that does it. Those are very much subjective questions that I think ought to remain subjective. I think the issues that we can, as social scientists, define and understand a little more coherently in numbers are things in terms of partisanship. And I think where the real emergency is in American democracy around redistricting is around minorities of voters electing majorities of representatives. And I think that's more where this rubber really hits the road.
Yes, sir.
Good housekeeping. I know that Soros, former Attorney General Holden, and a number of people have been interested in this issue. Who is funding your group, and where do you get your money from, and that sort of thing?
The question is, where does Fair Districts Louisiana get its funding? We are currently not even incorporated right now, and we get our funding from our three founders' checking accounts.
Okay.
From the three founders' checking accounts. We're self-funded.
Oh.
Yeah. Sir.
You guys feel like African Americans and Democrats in this state are underrepresented right now? I'm talking about on the House level, national.
The question is, are African Americans and Democrats underrepresented right now? I guess that question is best answered by percentage of vote versus percent representation. I don't have those numbers right now.
The first year post 2010 redistricting in the U.S. House, the Republicans had a 33-seat majority, if my memory serves me correctly. And that was from not a huge minority, but a minority of the popular vote. In terms of African Americans, we don't have proportionality in terms of the number of black people in the U.S. House and Senate relative to the 13-14% of the American population that checks that box on the census. It's very difficult to really get to that number. But America, among other sort of electoral democracies, frankly, we're doing a whole lot better than we were a number of decades ago.
Yeah.
The Voting Rights Act has worked very well in terms of that issue. I just wanted to readdress, Sue Lincoln asked a question we didn't answer, about what about the Voting Rights Act and how does this relate? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it was just to be sure that I know Department of Justice has to look over the
I-
redistricting plans before they're.
Yeah, pretty clear.
Actually, they don't, because of a Supreme Court case, Shelby County versus Holder, 2013. Louisiana and everywhere else in the country, until the Congress acts, and it doesn't appear it's going to be acting anytime soon, is no longer held to what was called Section 5 pre-clearance. So in 2011, 2012, Eric Holder did sign off, without much objection that I'm aware of, to Louisiana's redistricting plan. That's the reason why lots of things have happened in the past, but going forward towards 2020, unless Congress does something before then, Louisiana is just like all the other states. We don't have to ask permission from the Attorney General's office for our district.
Obviously, while partisanship is growing in the state capitol compared to what we were used to in the old days, nevertheless, the fact is that the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee in the Republican legislature is chaired by a Democrat. Incumbent protection has been the dominant force in the state legislature. How do you address that in your kind of discussion of partisanship when, in fact, the chairman of the Democratic Party is charge of the committee in the Republican Senate?
The question was the fact that the committee that draws the lines is chaired by a Democrat, and how do we kind of deal with the fact that it would be a Democrat chairing the committee that would be withdrawing it, I guess. To answer your question, there are vested interests of both sides, and there has to be enough of a public outcry to kind of counteract the vested interests in both the minority and majority party, because the power of the incumbency obviously is very important, but if there is enough public focus on this, they will respond to their constituents.
I'll just add a bit, if you were asking about incumbency protection specifically. One of the things that has been a real watershed from the 2010 redistricting cycle, nationwide, is a shift from incumbency protection gerrymanders, particularly in the states that were Republican governors, Republican state senate, single party. In the case of Maryland, it was all Democrats on the side, and they did the same thing. It's not protecting your incumbents, it's maximizing your party's power. If you recall, Edwin Edwards was on the Jim Inkster show a few weeks ago, and he was asked about this briefly, and he said, well, back when I was in the legislature, back when I was in the governor, you redistricted to protect the incumbent. You didn't redistrict to help your party. And typical of Edwin Edwards, he's had a very smart comment embedded within that. It wasn't necessarily good, but that was the way that it was cooked, and we are cooking a different cake now in America, particularly where we don't have divided government. When you have divided government, which if John Bell Edwards is governor in 2021, he can veto, if we don't change all of this, what happens. And then I would predict we would have incumbency protection for both parties. If we have all one party in charge, we're going to have a aggressive partisan gerrymander to flip as many seats as possible.
One more question. Or was there somebody else? Okay, I'll.
Okay.
Okay. You said something earlier about there is going to be money flowing into this process. What did you mean by
She's asking about the money that's going to be flowing into the redistricting process. So in 2010, there was Project Roadmap, which is a well-funded Republican operation to partisan gerrymander districts all around the nation. And the Democrats were sleeping at the wheel. This time around, neither major party is going to be asleep at the wheel, and there's going to be huge funding into from both sides trying to get partisan advantage through redistricting. And this has already happened. President Obama is and Eric Holder are the head of the Democratic effort, and I no doubt the Republicans are also hard at work with this already. So anything to add to that?
I mean, if you think 2010 was something,
Yeah.
2020 is going to be worse, and it's
Yeah.
going to be, both sides are going to bring a gun to this knife fight next time.
It's going to be very brutal unless the system is fixed.
Thank you.
We speak of the Democrats and Republicans, but today there's a substantial amount of independence. How does that actually factor into this redistricting discussion?
How do independents factor into the redistricting discussion, given that independents are the largest voting bloc in the nation? Yes. If you eliminate partisan gerrymandering, you increase the impact that independents have on the election, because elections happen on election day and not during the primaries. Yes, sir.
Can you comment, or I guess you're well aware of the McKinney case in Georgia represented, what, I know it was gerrymandering districting, like more minorities, and it backfired. Are you familiar with that case, or can you explain what happened?
He's asking about the McKinney case in Georgia, and I'm not as familiar with it. Are you?
I'm not either, but I believe you're referring to former Representative Cynthia McKinney. I don't want to go beyond what I can recollect here, and I can't look things up while I'm here at the podium. There are certainly trade-offs. I think they're overemphasized, including which could be done against fair districting and redistricting reform in Louisiana, to say that racial minorities will suffer from making overall partisanship more muted in how we draw districts. Because particularly in a state like Louisiana, where you still have very high racial polarization in terms of voting, and in terms of party registration, you often need a fairly high percentage of African Americans in a district for that community's choice of representative to have a fair chance of getting elected, not being diluted in the larger majority. So that is a risk, but again, I think many other states can manage this, and I think Louisiana could do so. This is obviously a majority Republican state, and it's going to probably remain that way for the foreseeable future. But it doesn't need to be, for any political party, a electoral map that is grossly over-representing the actual electoral strength of the party. And to your question about independence, political consultants often note how people actually vote, not how they're registered. So they are very well aware when they draw these maps, and I would hope that any other electoral reform would do the same, of recognizing actual voting behavior, not just party reference and so forth, because they know exactly what's predicted out of a particular precinct.
Yes, sir.
The Cynthia McKinney that John Hightower was referring to, as I recall, had Middle Eastern link to it. Am I remembering that race correctly?
It's another question about the McKinney case, and I'm drawing a blank on it right now. I apologize. Yeah.
No comment.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds like a job for Google. Is it?
Just to wrap it up, I guess, what's at stake here?
What is at stake if gerrymandering is not solved? There are many issues with polarization and radicalization in our democracy, and redistricting reform will not be a panacea. There will still be plenty of problems, but it sure is a huge part of the problem. So it's kind of a requirement that this be solved before the rest of the problems plaguing the long-term health of our democracy are solved. So it's fundamental that we solve this if we are to have a healthy democracy in the future.
I'll raise his bet. I'll meet his bet and raise it. I think what's at stake is the principles of American constitutional democracy, no less. There's lots of other serious dangers, I think, to American constitutional democracy in 2017. But if you go all the way back to your civics class, you remember when we set up the Senate and the House. It was the so-called Connecticut Compromise. And the U.S. House was supposed to be chosen directly by the people. The Senate was to be elected from the state houses, from the state legislatures. Under extreme partisan gerrymandering, the state legislatures choose our elected House representatives in large part. They draw the districts that allow certain people to get elected and certain people don't. And that is against, I would argue, from a kind of originalist Antonin Scalia perspective, that is a violation of what we meant the Constitution to mean. And the more fundamental principle is what is often said. The voters elect the representatives. With partisan gerrymandering, the representatives elect their voters.
Yep, they
And that's
choose
what
their
we
own
have
voters.
to return back to what it's supposed to be.
Yes. And I guess we can end the quote by John Adams in his Thoughts on Government from 1776. Our representative body should be a model in miniature of the people. And it's not right now. And so let's return to that.